The olive tree is a powerful symbol across the Middle East and Mediterranean. It was sacred to Isis for Egyptians, called liquid gold by Greeks in the Iliad, and a symbol of peace in the Psalms for Jews. Christians associate it with Gethsemane, where Christ prayed, and Muslims link olives to Muhammad. Cultivated as early as the 8th millennium BCE in the Levant, this land has been known as Canaan, Eretz Yisrael, and Palestine. Contrary to misconceptions, Palestine appears in ancient texts like those of Herodotus. In this episode, we will investigate how Palestine got its name, as well as discuss its vibrant and diverse history, from the Neolithic to the Roman period. Welcome to our video on the history and name of Palestine. This video is sponsored by our YouTube members and patrons, who get 2 exclusive videos weekly, not available anywhere else, for their kind support of our channel. You can join their ranks to watch more than 160 videos, including our series on the Pacific War, Punic Wars, Persian Wars, Spanish War of Succession, Russo-Japanese War, North African Campaign of World War II, History of Prussia, Italian Unification Wars, Risorgimento, Albigensian Crusades, and much more. Click the link in the description or pinned comment to get the exclusive videos, early access to all public videos, our schedule, wallpapers, access to a special Discord server where we're very active, and much more. Thanks for supporting us, we couldn't be doing it without your help. Before we jump into the history of Palestine, we should first discuss the history of the name itself. The word Palestine is often assumed to come from Syria Palestina, the name that Emperor Hadrian gave to the Roman province of Judea after putting down the Great Jewish Revolt of 66 AD. However, the name Palestine, much like the olive tree, has far deeper roots. The word first appears in the writings of the Greek historian Herodotus, who predated the rise of Rome by several centuries. However, the origin of the name Palestine may predate even further the father of history himself. It likely comes from one of the tribes of sea peoples as far back as the late Bronze Age called the Peliset, who appear under the name in both ancient Mesopotamian and Egyptian sources. In short, the name Palestine, when used to refer to both a place and a people, is a millennia older than its supposed Roman origin. Of course, the land of Palestine has had many other names throughout history, while the territorial boundaries of what constitutes Palestine have fluctuated over the centuries. Eretz Yisrael, or Land of Israel, is a name that appears in biblical sources, and its boundaries also vary to include parts of Lebanon and Syria, but exclude parts of southern Palestine, which the Bible calls the land of Edom. The Holy Land, meanwhile, is a mostly Christian name that appeared in the Middle Ages and refers primarily to Jerusalem and other sites in the Levant considered holy to Christianity. The name Canaan broadly refers to the southern Levant and is also present in biblical texts. The historical kingdoms of Israel and Judah ruled parts of this territory, but never reigned over all of Canaan, or the Promised Land. Throughout the ages, the boundaries of what people consider to be Israel, Palestine, Canaan, Judea, and the Holy Land have shifted to sometimes include various parts of modern Israel and Palestine, and contracted or expanded beyond them at other times. The Eastern Roman Empire, which survived into the Middle Ages after the fall of its Western counterpart, also had 3 separate provinces called Palestina Prima, Palestina Secunda, and Palestina Salitoris, controlling the local territories from Constantine's reign to the Arab conquest, with a brief Sasanian interregnum in the 610s. Over the centuries, the name Palestine has undergone surges of popularity among the people who lived in the southern Levant, but has always coexisted with myriad other identities, both geographical and cultural. Having covered that, let us now step back into the obscure mists of prehistory and begin our recounting of the history of Palestine from the very beginning. We will begin our whistle-stop tour of Palestinian history in the Neolithic Stone Age, during which agricultural societies were already forming along the Levantine coast. By the time we get to the Bronze Age, these agricultural settlements increased in size, and Palestine entered a long period of contact with the Eastern Mediterranean. Palestine, or Canaan during the Bronze Age, was mostly a clan-based society, a collection of urban and rural settlements decorating the rich countryside. These would eventually develop into the various kingdoms made known to us from biblical sources, such as Moab, Edom, Israel, and Judah. The most likely religious composition at the time was a broader Semitic polytheism, much like their cousins to the north, who would become the Phoenicians. In fact, the interplay of this common religious milieu appears in how the storm god Baal, a popular Phoenician deity, influenced later deities like El and Yahweh, whose hybridization led to the God of the Hebrew Bible. Like any land that straddles the crossroads between empires, Canaan was caught in the geopolitics of the giants of the period. Throughout the Bronze Age, ancient Egypt would prove to be a steady influence on the broader Near East, while Canaanite cities continued to trade with both Egypt and ancient Mesopotamia as the trade networks of the epoch continued to grow. As the late Bronze Age dawned in the 1500s BCE, the sun god of the Egyptians, Ra, wrestled in the sky with the storm god of the Hittites, Tahuna, for control of the land of the gods, Yahweh and El. Canaan was one of the battlegrounds between the mighty Hittite and Egyptian empires during this period, and eventually came under the control of the Egyptians. The Egyptians left a physical mark on the region, appearing to have built various administrative complexes throughout Canaan. Under Egyptian rule, local Canaanite clan structures survived, although the local structure infused itself with Egyptian culture. This form of cultural entanglement was common throughout the late Bronze Age. The Canaanite populations during this time appear to have worshipped a mixture of Egyptian and local deities, such as in the false temple in Tel Lachish, where a local proto-cult was mixed with a cult of the Egyptian goddess Hathor. The end of the Bronze Age in the 1200s BCE and the various turbulences that ensued were significant turning points for the region. It is during this period that a name approximating Palestine appears, probably through a tribe of the so-called Sea Peoples called the Peleset. The Peleset may have come from Greece, but this is far from confirmed, and their name first appears in regional Egyptian records. The Sea Peoples are often claimed to have been one of the causes of the end of the Bronze Age through their mass raids. However, the paradigm of mass invasions and migrations has been questioned by scholars, as well as the notion that these were one cohesive ethnic group, and it is also probable that a lot of cultural mixture took place between new arrivals and existing populations. While we have some evidence of social disruption, it is best to see Palestine as undergoing a period of transition into the more decentralized Iron Age. Throughout the Iron Age, the land of Palestine was a diverse tapestry of many cultures. It was also an era of political consolidation, when kingdoms began to appear along the coast and in the hinterlands. In the region of Pentapolis, straddling the coast, a confederation of 5 primarily Philistine cities formed. In the south, the kingdom of Edom reigned over what is today the Negev desert, while in the east, the kingdom of Moab reigned over the east bank of the Jordan. In 1208 BCE, the first mention of Israelites as a people outside of the Hebrew Bible appears in the Meneptah Stele. It is also during this period that biblical accounts begin to definitively correspond to the events of history. In the central hinterlands and the north, the kingdom of Judah and the kingdom of Israel were formed by the consolidation of tribal clans. The biblical king of Israel, David, is likely a real historical figure from the 9th century BCE, as archaeologists have discovered records in the land of the historical kingdom of Israel a few decades after his reign, mentioning him by name. Religious life across the Levantine realms during this time was in a period of transition, as rituals like keeping kosher appeared, but polytheism remained the norm in most kingdoms. Canaanite polytheism was similar to the religion of the Phoenicians, for they were related peoples whose languages both belonged to the Semitic tree. However, Phoenician and Canaanite religion had regional differences. What we can tell is that as the kingdoms consolidated, a single god would emerge from their polytheistic pantheons as the chief and patron god of their kingdom. It is here that the first temple of Judaism appeared in Jerusalem, a religious complex devoted to Yahweh, the patron god of Israel. First Temple Judaism was very different from later Judaism. The Jewish people during this period were monolatric, meaning they believed in other gods, but put a specific and singular devotion in their worship of Yahweh. The various kingdoms of the region traded and warred with each other as often as the rest of their neighbors throughout the expanses of the Mediterranean did. In fact, the 2 kingdoms of Israel and Judah were most likely one kingdom that split into 2 sometime in the 10th century CE due to internecine strife. However, recent scholarly debates consider the opposite to have been the case, with the 2 kingdoms merging at some point during the reigns of Kings Josiah and Hezekiah, though we are unsure of when exactly this occurred. As the early Iron Age transitioned into the late Iron Age, the kingdoms of Palestine fought one another as around them empires began to form. During this era, biblical sources become more useful as a historical primary source, with the Kingdom of Judah taking center stage on its pages. A Paleo-Hebrew writing system, based on the Phoenician alphabet, also begins to appear during this period. Pentapolis, Moab and Edom also continued to exist and interact with both the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. It is here that biblical stories, like those of Josiah, the king who probably initiated the shift towards monotheism in Judaism, and Hezekiah, the king who withstood a siege by the Assyrian king Sennacherib, come into the fore. However, we must bear in mind that some of these biblical books were written centuries after both Josiah and Hezekiah's reigns. With that said, the historical legacy of these legendary Jewish kings are sometimes evident in the archaeological record, such as in the cisterns underneath Jerusalem, which were built during Hezekiah's reign. Eventually, the heyday of the Hebrew kingdoms came to an end when the armies of Marduk began to march from Babylonia. Sweeping into the Levant, the Babylonian Empire descended down from Syria and destroyed the Kingdom of Israel in around 720 BCE. Judah survived for 2 more centuries, until 587 BCE, when it too was destroyed, and the first temple in Jerusalem is said to have been ruined. Other local Canaanite kingdoms were annexed by the Babylonians as well. For Judaism, this is the start of the Babylonian exile, where biblical sources claim the Jewish people were expelled from Palestine to Babylon. However, it should be noted that it was the elites who were mostly exiled to Babylon. This would prove a seminal turning point in the history of Judaism, turning it from a regional sect with a backbone in local Canaanite religious ideals to one influenced by Canaanite, Babylonian, and eventually even Iranian sources. Babylon was one of the hubs of culture of the ancient world, and the local elites had allowed the Jews to trade and buy land in the region. While in exile in Babylon, the local Jewish elites came into contact with the local Babylonian intellectual milieu, resulting in a cultural cross-pollination which led to an evolution in the Jewish religion through the innovations of Jewish priests and judges. Now rigidly monotheistic, Judaism had begun shifting into something more familiar to Judaism as it is currently known. The coming of the Persian Achaemenid Empire to the Levant under Cyrus the Great allowed the exiled elites to return and consolidate local rule in Palestine. Called a Messiah in the Hebrew Bible, Cyrus allowed for the return of the elites in 538 BCE, and is celebrated for this in the Jewish tradition. It is during this era that the name Palestine first appears in Herodotus's histories to describe at least the coast of the region. The Second Temple of Jerusalem was built during this period, and served as the center of a now fully monotheistic faith, with elaborate rituals such as Yom Kippur, where the divine name of Yahweh was to be uttered in the Holy of Holies within the temple. While not celebrated in the same way, the festival survives in Judaism to this day, a testament to the antiquity of the Jewish tradition. The theology of Judaism also had a major shift during the period of Persian rule, as Zoroastrianism's moral and dualistic cosmology gave birth to notions of angels and demons within the Jewish religion. In Palestine itself, Persian satraps cooperated with local Jewish and Canaanite elites to rule the region. The Persians had a policy of religious tolerance and preferred to rule their outlying territories through native intermediaries. By this time, the Philistine Confederacy of Pentapolis was no more, likely ruined after the Babylonian Empire's conquest and since incorporated into the Persian Empire's satrapal state apparatus. Another intriguing development during this period is the appearance of the Samaritans, cousins to the Jews. This sect claims descent from the Kingdom of Israel, like the Jews, and has its own version of sacred texts and laws. They also conduct rituals, like sacrifices on Mount Gerizim. Trade played a big role during this period, as various cities and peoples competed for trading privileges, such as the Phoenicians to the north and the Kedarites in the south. In the 4th century BCE, the armies of Alexander the Great came marching into Palestine, after devastating Tyre on their way to Egypt. In Jewish legends, the Macedonian world conqueror is said to have prostrated before the high priest of the Second Temple upon his arrival in Jerusalem, but this may be propaganda. After Alexander's death and the fragmentation of his empire, the Wars of the Diadochi began. During this time, the kingdom of Nabatea, run by northern Arabian peoples, took control of the southern Levant around the Negev desert, while the north was taken over initially by the Ptolemies and then by the Seleucids, two Hellenistic kingdoms ruled by Greek-speaking elites and based in Egypt and Syria respectively. Judaism and Hellenism made quick frenemies of each other. Just like Babylonian and Persian religion before it, Hellenistic philosophy influenced Judaism, as did Greek theatre on plays of biblical tales. The cultural influence that the Hellenistic Seleucids began to exert over Judea soon began to cause a cultural schism between more Hellenized Jews and more conservative Jews. This, alongside other issues with Greeks, like the Seleucid king Antiochus IV trying to get money from the Second Temple, caused the Maccabean revolt in 161 BCE. This revolt, which was also a civil war between Hellenized and traditional Jews, ended in 141 BCE with the establishment of the Hasmonean dynasty, an independent Jewish state. This dynasty was initially a powerful regional player, asserting its independence from the Seleucids and even conquering Edom, supposedly converting the region to Judaism. Eventually, the Hasmonean dynasty was replaced by the Herodian kingdom. This kingdom, ruled by Herod the Great, eventually became part of the Roman Empire, after 2 centuries of on and off vassalage between the Ptolemies, Seleucids, Parthians, and eventually the Romans. The melting pot of the Roman period was to prove seminal for Judea and the world. New Jewish factions had appeared in the previous period, like the Pharisees, Sadducees, Zealots, and Essenes. Eventually, Hellenistic and Jewish thought, continuously in conflict and dialogue, produced 2 new religious movements. One was Rabbinical Judaism, the Judaism that dominates today and places emphasis on legal and ritual obligations. The other was early Christianity, whose founding figure, Jesus of Nazareth, was educated in these very rabbinical circles, as evidenced by his knowledge of Jewish law, or halakha, in the New Testament. The Nabatean kingdom continued to thrive as a hub of Arabian and Hellenistic culture, while the Herodian dynasty splintered into the Herodian Tetrarchy. Judaism continued to be present in the region as Christianity grew, but after the Jewish revolt of 66 CE and bloody battles like the one fought at Masada Fortress, the Romans ethnically cleansed parts of Judea-Palestine of its Jewish populations. The Jewish diaspora, already present since the Babylonian exile and further grown via trade in the Roman Empire, was already more populous, and their numbers grew in the various Mediterranean and Middle Eastern cities. Despite their losses, the Jewish people continued to rebel against the Romans, such as in the Kitos War of 115 to 117 CE, and eventually the Bar Kokhba Revolt of 132 to 136 CE, compelling the Romans to double down on the clampdowns and ethnic cleansing of the Jews in the region. Contrary to popular belief, we have no definitive evidence that Hadrian forcibly changed the region's name from Judea to Syria-Palestina. It is more likely that the names Judea and Palestina had coexisted in the region for centuries, with Palestine being more dominant after the Jewish revolts. However, despite the demographic impact of Roman rule in Palestine, Rabbinic Judaism survived in the region and was even active in judicial and communal debates amongst the Jewish communities. As late Roman antiquity dawned upon Palestine, more and more Christians of various sects changed the region's religious and cultural ecosystems alongside the Jewish community that continued to be there. By the time of Constantine, Palestine was as diverse as in the Bronze Age, with Jews, Samaritans, pagans, Gnostics, and Christians living side by side in a tapestry of Greek, Egyptian, Semitic, Jewish, and Near Eastern cultural influences. As the Roman period ended, Palestine was increasingly Christian, while retaining its Jewish and Samaritan presence. Though dwindling, pagans remained, and many from these faiths would later convert to Islam. With names like Canaan, Eretz Yisrael, Zion, and Palestine, more would follow, including the Holy Land. Palestine's diverse past reflects a blend of inhabitants rooted in the region for centuries. New peoples and faiths found ways to establish themselves here, much like the enduring olive tree. The land, celebrated by poets Mahmoud Darwish and Yehuda Amichai, has offered shade and sustenance to all, Christian, Jewish, Muslim, or Samaritan. More videos on the social, political, and religious history of the Middle East are on the way. Make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to ensure you don't miss them. Recently, we've started releasing weekly Patreon and YouTube member-exclusive content. Consider joining their ranks via the link in the description or button under the video. To watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.